The stagecoach wheel cracked against a buried rock beneath the snow, sending Josephine Abbott sprawling into a snowdrift 6 feet deep as the driver cursed and fought to control the panicked horses. She gasped as the freezing wind cut through her traveling dress like 1,000 tiny knives, her fingers already turning numb as she struggled to pull herself upright in the waist-deep snow. The December wind howled across the Colorado mountains with a fury that seemed almost personal, and she could barely see 3 feet ahead through the blinding white curtain that surrounded her. Behind her, she heard the driver shout something, but the words were torn away by the gale before they reached her ears. Josephine tried to call back, tried to tell him she was alive, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. Her teeth chattered so violently she bit her tongue, tasting copper. She had been traveling from Denver to the small mining town of Palisade to take up a position as a schoolteacher, a journey that should have taken 2 days in good weather. Instead, they had been caught in this blizzard on the 3rd day, and now she found herself alone in the snow, watching as the stagecoach pulled away without her. The driver probably thought she had fallen off miles back, or perhaps he simply could not stop without risking his own life and the lives of his other passengers. Either way, she was alone. She tried to take a step forward, but her skirts were so heavy with snow and ice that she could barely move. The wind pushed against her with such force that she stumbled backward, falling again into the snow. This time, she could not find the strength to stand. Her entire body shook with cold, violent tremors that rattled her bones and made her teeth ache. She wrapped her arms around herself, but her thin coat provided almost no protection against the bitter wind. She had foolishly believed that her winter clothes from Boston would be sufficient for Colorado, but she had been terribly, fatally wrong. Josephine felt tears freeze on her cheeks as she realized she was going to die here, alone in the snow. She was only 22 years old, and her life was about to end before it had truly begun. She thought of her mother back in Boston, who had begged her not to go west, who had warned her that the frontier was no place for a proper young lady. She thought of the children she would never teach, the life she would never live. The cold was beginning to feel less painful now, almost comfortable, and some distant part of her mind recognized this as a bad sign. She did not hear the horse approach through the roar of the wind. She did not see the rider until he was almost on top of her, a dark shape looming out of the white. Strong hands grabbed her shoulders and she tried to pull away, tried to scream, but she had no strength left. A deep voice spoke close to her ear, words she could not quite make out, and then she was being lifted, pulled against something warm and solid. She felt herself being placed on a horse, felt arms wrapping around her from behind, holding her in place as the horse began to move. Josephine tried to speak, tried to ask who this person was and where they were going, but her lips would not form words. The shaking had gotten worse, her entire body convulsing with cold. The arms around her tightened, and she felt warmth beginning to seep through her frozen clothes. She leaned back against the solid chest behind her, too cold and too tired to care whether this stranger meant her harm or good. At least if she died now, she would not die alone in the snow. Time became meaningless. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the movement of the horse beneath her and the arms holding her steady. Once, she felt the horse stop, and a thick coat was wrapped around her over her own inadequate one. The coat smelled of leather and smoke and something else, something distinctly masculine. The arms pulled her back against that warm chest, and she felt a voice rumbling against her back as the man spoke, though she still could not make out the words over the wind. When Josephine opened her eyes again, they were no longer moving through the blizzard. She was inside somewhere, lying on something soft. A fire crackled nearby, and the warmth of it made her skin tingle painfully as sensation began to return to her frozen limbs. She tried to sit up, but her body refused to cooperate. Every muscle ached and the shaking had not stopped. "Easy now," a voice said, and she turned her head to see a man crouching beside her. He was tall, she could tell even with him kneeling, with broad shoulders and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were a deep brown, warm and concerned as they studied her face. He had a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble, and there was a small scar above his left eyebrow. He wore simple clothes, wool pants and a flannel shirt, both well worn but clean. "You are still freezing. Need to warm you up slow or it will hurt worse." "Who?" Josephine tried to say, but her teeth were chattering too hard to get the word out properly. "Name is Owen Mercer," the man said. He reached out and pulled a heavy blanket up over her shoulders. "Found you in the snow about 2 miles back. What in the blazes were you doing out in a blizzard?" "Stagecoach," Josephine managed to say. "Fell." Owen's expression darkened. "Driver did not stop for you," she shook her head, and he muttered something under his breath that she suspected was a curse. He stood and moved to the fire, ladling something from a pot that hung over the flames. When he returned, he had a tin cup filled with steaming liquid. He slid an arm behind her shoulders and helped her sit up enough to drink. The broth was hot and salty, and it burned her throat going down, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. "Slow," Owen cautioned as she tried to gulp it down. "Too fast and you will just bring it back up." Josephine forced herself to sip slowly, even though every instinct screamed at her to drain the cup in seconds. As she drank, she looked around the space they were in. It was a small cabin, just one room with rough wooden walls and a packed dirt floor. There was a bed in one corner where she lay, a table and 2 chairs near the fire, and not much else. Shelves held basic supplies, and she could see a rifle hanging on the wall near the door. Snow was piled against the single window, blocking out most of the light, but the fire provided enough illumination to see by. "Where are we?" she asked when she had finished the broth. "Old Trapper's cabin," Owen said, taking the empty cup from her. "About 5 miles outside Palisade. I was heading back to town when I spotted you. Lucky I did. Another hour and you would have been frozen solid." Josephine shuddered at how close she had come to death. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. "You saved my life." Owen shrugged as if saving lives was something he did every day. "Could not very well leave you there," he said. He moved back to the fire and refilled the cup. "You have a name, Josephine Abbott," she said. "I was on my way to Palisade. I am supposed to be the new schoolteacher." "That's so." Owen turned to look at her with interest. "Town has been waiting for a teacher for near about 6 months now. Folks will be mighty pleased to know you made it." He brought the cup back to her. "Once this storm passes, I will get you to town. Might be a day or 2, though. This blizzard is not going anywhere fast." Josephine accepted the second cup of broth gratefully. Now that she was beginning to thaw, the shaking was getting worse instead of better, and her fingers ached terribly. She tried to hold the cup, but her hands trembled so badly that she nearly spilled it. Owen sat down on the edge of the bed and wrapped his hands around hers, steadying them. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked hard for his living, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "Give it time," he said quietly. "The shaking will pass." They sat like that for several minutes, his hands wrapped around hers as she sipped the broth. Josephine found herself studying his face. He was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and those warm brown eyes that seemed to see right through her. There was something solid and dependable about him, something that made her feel safe despite the fact that she was alone in a cabin with a strange man miles from anywhere. "What do you do?" she asked, partly to distract herself from how cold she still felt and partly because she was genuinely curious. In Palisade, I mean. Ranch hand mostly, Owen said. Work for the Mitchell spread about 10 miles south of town. Was coming back from delivering some horses to a buyer in Glenwood Springs when the storm hit. He glanced toward the window, where the wind still howled. Going to be a bad one. Good thing this cabin was here. Do you use it often? Now and then, when I am out this way. Old trapper who built it died about 5 years back. No family. Folks around here use it as a way station when the weather turns bad. He released her hands as she finished the second cup of broth. How are you feeling? Warmer, Josephine said, though she was still shaking. Everything hurts. That is a good sign, Owen said. Means you are not frozen through. Might lose a toe or two if we are not careful, though. Need to check your feet. Josephine felt her face heat with embarrassment. The idea of this man seeing her feet, of him touching her bare skin, was deeply improper. But even as she thought it, she realized how ridiculous it was to worry about propriety when he had just saved her life. Besides, if she lost her toes to frostbite, she would have much bigger problems than a damaged reputation. All right, she said quietly. Owen nodded and moved to the end of the bed. Josephine looked away as he carefully removed her boots, which had frozen solid, and then her stockings. She heard him inhale sharply and forced herself to look. Her feet were white and waxy looking, the toes an alarming shade of purple. Not good, Owen muttered. He moved quickly, bringing a basin of water from near the fire. This is going to hurt, he warned her, but we need to warm them up gradual. He was right. The moment he lowered her feet into the lukewarm water, Josephine cried out in pain. It felt as if someone was driving needles into her flesh, thousands of them all at once. She gripped the blanket with both hands, biting her lip to keep from screaming. Owen kept one hand on her ankle, his thumb rubbing small circles against her skin in what she realized was meant to be a comforting gesture. I know, he said, his voice low and soothing. I know it hurts, but you are doing fine. Just breathe through it. Josephine tried to follow his advice, forcing herself to take slow, deep breaths. Gradually, the pain began to ease, though her feet still throbbed terribly. Owen checked them carefully, his brow furrowed with concentration. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he lifted them out of the water and dried them gently with a cloth. Think you will keep them all, he said, and she heard the relief in his voice. Toes are coming back to a healthier color. Still going to hurt for a few days, though. He wrapped her feet in clean, dry cloths and then pulled the blanket back over them. Josephine sagged back against the pillows, exhausted from the pain. Her whole body ached, and she could not seem to stop shaking. Owen studied her for a moment, then made a decision. You need more warmth, he said. Blankets alone are not doing it fast enough. He hesitated, then added, I am going to lie down next to you, share body heat. That is the fastest way to warm you up, but I give you my word as a gentleman that I will not touch you inappropriately. This is purely medical. Josephine knew she should protest. Every rule of proper society screamed that this was wrong, that allowing a man into her bed would ruin her reputation forever. But she was still so cold, and she could see the genuine concern in Owen's eyes. He was not trying to take advantage of her. He was trying to keep her alive. All right, she whispered. Owen removed his boots and then lay down on top of the blankets beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. But even with the layers between them, Josephine could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He pulled another blanket over both of them, and then, slowly, he moved closer until his chest was pressed against her back. One arm came around her waist, pulling her against him. The position was exactly like how he had held her on the horse, but now she was aware enough to truly feel it. "Just sleep," Owen said softly, his breath warm against her hair. "You are safe. I have got you." And despite everything, despite the impropriety and the strangeness of the situation, Josephine believed him. She closed her eyes and let herself relax into his warmth. The shaking began to ease, her muscles slowly unknotting. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was the steady rhythm of Owen's heartbeat against her back, and the feeling of his arm holding her close. When Josephine woke, gray light was filtering through the gaps in the snow piled against the window. The fire had burned down to embers, but she was warm, almost too warm. It took her a moment to remember where she was and why there was a solid male body pressed against her back. She tensed, and immediately Owen's arm loosened. "You are awake," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Josephine said, and it was true. The shaking had stopped, and while her body still ached, the terrible bone-deep cold was gone. "Much better." Owen sat up, putting proper distance between them, and Josephine found herself missing his warmth immediately. She pushed the thought away and sat up as well, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Her dress had dried while she slept, though it was wrinkled and stained. Her feet throbbed when she moved them, but the pain was bearable. "Storm is still going," Owen said, nodding toward the window. "Probably will be for at least another day. Are you hungry?" Josephine realized she was starving. "Yes." Owen got up and stirred the fire back to life, adding more wood until flames leaped up cheerfully. He pulled a sack down from one of the shelves and began preparing a simple breakfast of bacon and beans. Josephine watched him work, noting the easy efficiency of his movements. He was clearly a man used to taking care of himself. "Can I help?" she asked. "You should rest," Owen said, but he glanced at her and must have seen something in her expression because he amended. "But if you are feeling up to it, you could make the coffee. Pot is on the shelf. Water is in the bucket by the door." Josephine stood carefully, testing her feet. They held her weight, though they ached. She made her way to the shelf and found the coffee pot and a tin of grounds. The water in the bucket had a thin layer of ice on top, which she had to break through. As she worked, she was acutely aware of Owen watching her, though he turned back to the bacon whenever she looked his way. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, sitting at the small table. The food was simple but good, and Josephine ate everything on her plate. She could not remember the last time she had been this hungry. When they had finished, Owen cleared the dishes and set them aside to wash later. "Tell me about Boston," he said, settling back into his chair. "That is where you are from, is it not? I can hear it in your voice." Josephine smiled. "Yes, Boston. Born and raised there. My father was a lawyer, my mother from a good family. They expected me to marry well and settle into a comfortable life. But you chose to come west instead," Owen said. "Why?" It was a question Josephine had asked herself many times over the past few months. "I wanted something more," she said slowly. "Something that was mine, something I chose for myself. In Boston, my entire life was mapped out for me before I was even born. The right schools, the right friends, the right husband. But I wanted adventure. I wanted to matter, to make a difference." She looked down at her hands. "My parents thought I was insane. My mother cried for a week when I told her I had accepted a teaching position in Colorado, but I could not spend the rest of my life wondering what if." Owen was quiet for a long moment. "That took courage," he said finally. "Leaving everything you knew behind to start fresh in a place like this. The frontier is hard, especially for women on their own." "Are you saying I made a mistake?" Josephine asked, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her voice. "No," Owen said quickly. "Not at all. I am saying I admire you for it. Most people never have the guts to chase what they really want. They settle, tell themselves they are happy when they are not." He stood and moved to the fire, poking at the logs. I came west for similar reasons. Grew up in Missouri, working my father's farm. It was a good life, but it was not my life, you know. So when I turned 18, I packed a bag and headed to Colorado. Been here for 7 years now, and I have never regretted it for a moment. Do you miss your family? Josephine asked. Sometimes, Owen admitted. I write to my mother once a month, let her know I am still alive. But I was never meant to be a farmer. Out here, I have got the mountains and the open sky and work that matters. I help bring in horses, move cattle, build things. Every day is different. That suits me just fine. They talked for hours as the storm raged outside. Owen told her about Palisade, a small town that had sprung up around the railroad and the nearby coal mines. It was rough around the edges, he warned her, with its share of drunks and troublemakers, but there were good people there too. Families trying to make a life, children who needed education, a community that was slowly building itself into something worthwhile. Josephine told him about her education, about the years she had spent preparing to be a teacher. She talked about her love of books and learning, about how she believed that education could change lives. Owen listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was truly paying attention. It had been a long time since anyone had listened to her like this, as if what she had to say actually mattered. As the day wore on, Josephine found herself relaxing in Owen's company. He made her laugh with stories about mishaps on the ranch, about ornery horses and stubborn cattle. He had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, and she discovered that she enjoyed his company more than she had enjoyed anyone's in a long time. There was no pretense with Owen, no games or false politeness. He was exactly who he appeared to be, straightforward and honest. That evening, after they had eaten a supper of beans and cornbread that Owen produced from his saddlebags, Josephine noticed that he kept glancing at the bed with a troubled expression. "What is wrong?" she asked. Owen rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncomfortable. "Nothing, it is just that, well, there is only the one bed. Last night you needed the warmth, but tonight you are better. I will sleep on the floor, give you privacy." Josephine looked at the hard-packed dirt floor and then at the bed, which was barely large enough for two but certainly more comfortable than the ground. She thought about how cold the cabin got at night, how she had still felt the chill even with Owen beside her sharing his warmth. "That is ridiculous," she said before she could think better of it. "The floor is freezing and you will be miserable. The bed is big enough for both of us if we are sensible about it." "Miss Abbott," Owen began, his voice strained, "that would not be proper." "Neither was you holding me all night last night," Josephine pointed out. "But it was necessary, and no harm came of it. We are both adults, and we can surely manage to share a bed for one more night without compromising anyone's honor." She saw him wavering and pressed her advantage. "Besides, if you sleep on the floor and catch your death of cold, how will you get me to Palisade when the storm ends?" Owen looked torn, but finally he nodded. "All right, but I will stay on top of the blankets and you will stay under them." "Agreed, agreed," Josephine said. They prepared for bed in awkward silence, each carefully looking away as the other made ready. Josephine kept her dress on, minus her still drying boots, and climbed under the blankets. Owen removed his shirt, revealing a muscled chest and arms that spoke of years of hard physical labor. Josephine tried not to stare, but it was difficult. She had never seen a man's bare chest before, and she found herself fascinated by the play of muscle under skin, the smattering of dark hair across his pectorals. Owen caught her looking and cleared his throat. "Sorry, but I will overheat with it on," he said, sounding embarrassed. He kept his pants on and lay down on top of the blankets, as far from her as the narrow bed would allow. They lay in silence for a long while, both staring up at the ceiling. The wind howled outside and snow pattered against the window. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Josephine was acutely aware of Owen's presence beside her, of the warmth radiating from his body even through the blankets. "Owen," she said quietly. "Yes, thank you. Not just for saving me, but for being kind. You did not have to be." She heard him shift, turning toward her though she kept her eyes on the ceiling. "What kind of man would I be if I was not kind to a woman who nearly died?" he said. "Besides, it has been nice having company. Gets lonely out here sometimes." Josephine did turn then, finding him closer than she expected. In the firelight his eyes were soft, his expression open. "It has been nice for me too," she admitted. "I was terrified about coming here alone, about starting a new life where I do not know anyone. But talking to you today, I feel like maybe it will be all right." "It will be more than all right," Owen said with certainty. "You are going to do fine, Miss Abbott. Those kids in Palisade are lucky to have you." They smiled at each other, and something passed between them, something warm and promising. Josephine felt her heart skip a beat, and suddenly she was very aware of how close Owen was, of how easy it would be to reach out and touch him. She saw his gaze drop to her lips for just a moment before he caught himself and looked away. "We should sleep," he said, his voice rough. "Storm might break tomorrow." "Yes," Josephine whispered, though sleep was the last thing on her mind now. "Good night, Owen. Good night, Josephine." It took Josephine a long time to fall asleep. She lay awake listening to Owen's breathing gradually slow and deepen as he drifted off. She thought about how safe she felt here with him, how right it felt to have him near. She thought about the way he had looked at her, the warmth in his eyes. She thought about what might happen when they reached Palisade and went their separate ways, and the thought filled her with an unexpected sadness. Finally, exhaustion claimed her, and she slept. She woke in the middle of the night to find that she had rolled toward Owen in her sleep, and he had somehow ended up under the blankets with her. His arm was around her waist again, and her head was tucked under his chin. She should have moved away, should have put proper distance between them, but she found she did not want to. Instead, she let herself enjoy the feeling of being held, of being close to someone who made her feel safe and valued. She would deal with the consequences in the morning. When dawn came, the wind had finally stopped. Josephine woke to find Owen already up, standing by the window and looking out. "Storm broke," he said when he saw she was awake. "We can head to Palisade today if you are feeling up to it." Josephine sat up, pushing her hair back from her face. She felt a pang of disappointment that their time alone together was ending, which was foolish. She barely knew this man, but in the 2 days they had spent together, she felt like she had come to know him better than people she had known for years back in Boston. "I am ready," she said. They prepared quickly, eating a cold breakfast and packing up Owen's few belongings. Owen checked Josephine's feet again, pronouncing them much improved, and helped her put her boots back on. They were still damp, but there was nothing to be done about it. He bundled her into his heavy coat again, and they stepped outside into a world transformed. The sun was shining brilliantly off the fresh snow, making Josephine squint against the glare. Drifts piled up against the cabin were taller than she was, and the landscape had been scoured clean by the wind. Everything was pristine and white and breathtakingly beautiful. Owen's horse stood in a small lean-to beside the cabin, and he spoke softly to the animal as he saddled it. "You will have to ride with me again," Owen said. "Hope that is all right." "Of course," Josephine said, though her heart started beating faster at the thought of being pressed against him for the hours it would take to reach town. Owen mounted first, then reached down and pulled her up in front of him. She settled into the saddle, her back against his chest, and his arms came around her to hold the reins. It was the same position they had been in when he found her. But now she was fully aware of every point of contact between them, of the strength in the arms holding her, of his breath stirring her hair. The ride to Palisade took 3 hours through the deep snow. Owen kept the horse at a careful walk, following the road when they could find it and cutting through the trees when they could not. They talked occasionally, but mostly they rode in comfortable silence. Josephine found herself memorizing the feeling of being held like this, knowing that once they reached town, it would never happen again. Palisade appeared around a bend in the road, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley between snow-covered mountains. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Josephine could see people moving about despite the cold. It was smaller than she had expected, maybe only 24 buildings total, but it looked solid and welcoming after the storm. Owen guided the horse down the main street, and people stopped to stare. A woman came out of the general store, shading her eyes against the sun, and called out, "Owen Mercer, is that you? Where in the blazes have you been? We thought you froze to death out there." "Near about," Owen called back. "Found someone else who nearly did, though. This here is Miss Josephine Abbott, the new schoolteacher." The woman's face lit up. "The teacher? Oh, thank heavens, we had heard the stage got caught in the storm and feared the worst." She hurried over, and Owen dismounted before helping Josephine down. "I am Margaret Thompson. My husband is the mayor, such as it is. You poor dear, you must be frozen through. Come inside and get warm." More people were gathering now, exclaiming over their arrival. Josephine found herself the center of attention, everyone asking questions at once. She tried to answer, but her head was spinning from the sudden transition from quiet solitude with Owen to this chaotic welcome. "Give her some space," Owen said firmly, and the crowd quieted. "She has been through an ordeal. Let her get settled before you pepper her with questions." Margaret nodded. "Of course, you are right. Miss Abbott, we have got a room ready for you at the boarding house. Let me take you there so you can rest." Josephine allowed herself to be led away, but she looked back over her shoulder at Owen. He was watching her go, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met, and she felt that connection again, strong as a physical pull. She wanted to go back to him, wanted to tell him that she was not ready to say goodbye yet, but Margaret was chattering about the school and the boarding house, and the moment passed. The boarding house was a neat 2-story building run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. The room Josephine was given was small but clean, with a real bed and a washstand, and even a small writing desk. After 2 days in the cabin, it felt almost luxurious. Margaret and Mrs. Patterson fussed over her, bringing hot water for washing and a proper meal. Other women from town stopped by to introduce themselves and welcome her, but through it all, Josephine found her thoughts drifting back to Owen. She wondered where he was, what he was doing. She wanted to thank him properly, wanted to see him again. When she finally worked up the courage to ask Margaret if she knew where Mr. Mercer was staying, the older woman gave her a knowing look. "Owen headed back out to the Mitchell Ranch," Margaret said. "Said he had been gone long enough and had work to catch up on. But I am sure he will be back in town before long. Ranch hands always come in on Saturday nights." Josephine felt a stab of disappointment so sharp it surprised her. She had not even gotten to say a proper goodbye, to tell him how much those days in the cabin had meant to her. She told herself she was being foolish, that he had only been doing what any decent person would do, but her heart refused to listen. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Josephine met with Mayor Thompson to discuss the school, which was a small building at the edge of town that had been sitting empty for months. She spent a day cleaning it out and organizing the few supplies that had been donated by townspeople. She met the families whose children would be her students, a mix of miners' kids, ranchers' kids, and the children of the few merchants in town. There were 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and they all looked at her with a combination of curiosity and suspicion. Josephine threw herself into preparing for the school to open, partly because she was excited about it and partly because it kept her from thinking about Owen. But at night, lying alone in her bed at the boarding house, she could not help but remember the feeling of his arms around her, the sound of his voice in the darkness, the way he had looked at her in the firelight. Saturday came, and Josephine found herself watching the street outside her window, looking for a familiar tall figure. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that Owen probably had no interest in seeing her again. He had done his duty and moved on with his life. But as evening fell and the saloon began to fill with ranch hands and miners looking to blow off steam, she could not stop herself from hoping. She was in her room reading when Mrs. Patterson knocked on her door. "Miss Abbott, you have got a visitor," the landlady said with a smile that suggested she knew exactly who the visitor was. Josephine's heart leaped. She checked her appearance quickly in the small mirror, smoothing her hair and pinching her cheeks to bring some color to them, then hurried downstairs. Owen stood in the parlor, turning his hat in his hands. He had cleaned up since she last saw him, wearing a fresh shirt and with his hair neatly combed. He looked nervous, which somehow made him even more endearing. "Owen," Josephine said, unable to keep the pleasure out of her voice. "I was hoping I would see you." "I wanted to check on you," Owen said. "Make sure you were settling in all right, and I've got your things." He held up a small carpet bag that Josephine recognized as her own. "Found it on the road where the stage threw you off. Figured you would want it back." "Oh, thank you." Josephine took the bag, which contained her few personal items and her books. "I thought it was lost forever." They stood there awkwardly for a moment until Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat. "Why do you not take Mr. Mercer to the sitting room, dear? I will bring some coffee." The sitting room was a small space off the main parlor, with a settee and 2 chairs arranged around a fireplace. Josephine and Owen sat down, carefully leaving a proper distance between them. Mrs. Patterson brought coffee and then discreetly withdrew, though she left the door open in accordance with propriety. "How have you been?" Owen asked. "Feet healing up all right." "Much better," Josephine said. "Just a little tender still. But the doctor says there will be no permanent damage, thanks to you." She smiled at him. "I never properly thanked you, Owen. You saved my life." "I am just glad I found you when I did," Owen said. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I have been thinking about you all week, wondering how you were doing." "I have been thinking about you too," Josephine admitted, emboldened by the look in his eyes. "Those days in the cabin, they meant a lot to me. I know it was just circumstance that threw us together, but I felt like I got to know you, really know you, and I liked what I saw." Owen set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Josephine, I am not good with pretty words. I am just a ranch hand and you are an educated lady from the city. But I cannot stop thinking about you. From the moment I pulled you out of that snow, you have been on my mind. The way you laughed at my stories, the way you looked at me when you thought I was not paying attention. I know it is too soon and maybe I am out of line, but I have got to know if you feel it too. This connection between us." Josephine's heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "I feel it," she whispered. "I have never felt anything like this before. It scares me how much I feel after knowing you for such a short time." Owen reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I want to court you proper," he said. "If you will let me. I know folks will talk, you being new in town and all, but I do not care about that. I care about you." "Yes," Josephine said without hesitation. "Yes, I want that too. The smile that spread across Owen's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture that was both old-fashioned and deeply romantic. Josephine felt warmth spread through her entire body at the touch of his lips on her skin. They talked for another hour, making plans. Owen would come to town every Saturday evening to take her to dinner. He would write to her during the week, and she would write back. They would take things slow, give themselves time to be sure of their feelings, but they would see where this connection led them. When Owen finally left, Josephine floated back up to her room feeling like her feet never touched the ground. Mrs. Patterson caught her eye and winked, and Josephine found herself blushing but not caring. She had come west looking for adventure and a new life, and it seemed she had found both, along with something she had not even known she was looking for. The school opened on Monday morning, and Josephine discovered that teaching was both more challenging and more rewarding than she had imagined. The children were rough around the edges, used to hard work and harder lives, but they were eager to learn. The younger ones soaked up knowledge like sponges, while the older ones required more coaxing to see the value in education. Josephine found herself drawing on every bit of patience and creativity she possessed. At the end of the first week, a small boy named Tommy brought her a handful of wildflowers he had picked on his way to school. "My ma says you are real pretty," he announced. "And she says Mr. Mercer is sweet on you." Josephine felt her face heat. "Your mother should not gossip," she said, but she could not help smiling as she put the flowers in a jar of water on her desk. The truth was that the whole town seemed to know about her and Owen. Palisade was small enough that secrets were impossible, and everyone had seen Owen's courting. But to Josephine's relief, most people seemed pleased by the development. Owen was well liked in town, considered a good, hard-working man, and people were happy to see him settling down. Saturday evenings became the highlight of Josephine's week. Owen would ride into town at sunset, cleaned up and carrying small gifts, a book he thought she would like, a pretty stone he had found, once a pair of soft leather gloves to replace the ones she had lost in the snow. They would have dinner at the boarding house, or, when the weather allowed, take walks through town. Sometimes they would sit in the parlor and just talk for hours, about everything and nothing. Owen told her about his dreams for the future. He had been saving his wages for years, and he hoped to buy his own piece of land someday, start a small ranch. Nothing fancy, just enough to support a family. When he said the word family, he looked at Josephine with such hope and longing that she felt her heart squeeze. Josephine told him about her fears and insecurities, about how sometimes she worried she was not good enough for these frontier children, who had seen more hardship than she could imagine. Owen assured her that she was making a difference, that the parents talked about how much their children were learning, how they came home excited about school for the first time. As winter gave way to spring, Josephine found herself falling more deeply in love with Owen. She loved his quiet strength, his gentle humor, his unwavering reliability. She loved the way he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. She loved the way he treated her as an equal, valuing her opinions and listening to her ideas. In April, Owen took her on a picnic up in the foothills above town. The wildflowers were starting to bloom, carpeting the meadows in yellow and purple and white. They sat on a blanket and ate the lunch Mrs. Patterson had packed for them, talking and laughing as they watched hawks circle overhead. After they had eaten, Owen grew quiet. He took Josephine's hand and held it between both of his, looking down at their interlaced fingers. "Josephine," he said, his voice serious, "I have been thinking about something and I need to know how you feel, about us, about the future." Josephine's heart started to race. "What do you mean?" Owen looked up at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her chest tighten. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you since that first night in the cabin when you fell asleep in my arms. Maybe even before that, when you were shaking in the snow and I knew I would do anything to save you. I love your courage and your kindness and your intelligence. I love the way you throw yourself into teaching those kids. I love everything about you." Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes. "Owen, I love you too, so much it scares me sometimes." "Then marry me," Owen said. "I know it has only been a few months, and I know I cannot offer you the fancy life you might have had back in Boston, but I can offer you a life full of love and adventure and hard work building something together. I can offer you my whole heart for as long as I live." Josephine did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." Owen pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time. It was a gentle kiss, full of promise and hope and love. Josephine wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, pouring all her feelings into the connection between them. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard and smiling so wide it hurt. "I am going to make you happy," Owen promised, his forehead resting against hers. "Every single day, I am going to make you happy." "You already do," Josephine said. They married in June in the small church at the center of Palisade. The whole town turned out for the ceremony, and even the Mitchell family, who Owen worked for, came in from the ranch. Josephine wore a simple white dress that Margaret Thompson and the other women of the town had helped her sew, and she carried wildflowers like the ones Tommy had brought her that first week of school. Owen wore his best suit, and when he saw her walking down the aisle, his eyes filled with tears. The ceremony was short and sweet. They exchanged vows in strong, clear voices, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Owen kissed her with such tenderness that Josephine forgot everyone else in the room existed. There was only Owen, only this moment, only the feeling of coming home to a place she had never been before. The reception was held at the boarding house, with food provided by seemingly everyone in town. There was music and dancing and laughter. Josephine danced with Owen, with Mayor Thompson, with several of her students' fathers. But her eyes kept finding Owen across the room, and every time she looked at him, he was already looking at her, his love written plainly on his face. As the sun set, Owen led her outside. He had borrowed a wagon from the ranch, and in the back was their luggage and wedding gifts from the townspeople. He helped her up onto the seat and then climbed up beside her, taking the reins. "Where are we going?" Josephine asked, though she did not really care as long as she was with him. "Home," Owen said with a smile. "I have got a surprise for you." They drove for about an hour, heading south and east into the foothills. The sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the air smelled of pine and sage. Finally, Owen turned the wagon off the main road onto a barely visible track through the trees. They emerged into a clearing with a small cabin at the center, newer than the trapper's cabin where they had sheltered from the storm but built in a similar style. "I bought this land 3 years ago," Owen said as he brought the wagon to a stop. "Been building the cabin in my spare time, bit by bit. It is not much yet, just 2 rooms, but it is ours. And there is enough land to start a small herd, maybe grow some crops. We can build onto the cabin as we need to, make it into a real home." Josephine looked at the cabin with tears streaming down her face. "It is perfect," she whispered. "Owen, it is absolutely perfect." He helped her down from the wagon and carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing. The interior was simple but well made, with a main room containing a kitchen area and sitting space, and a bedroom separated by a curtain. There was a fireplace built from river stones, a table Owen had clearly made himself, and a bed with a beautiful quilt that Josephine recognized as the handiwork of Margaret Thompson. Owen set her down and then pulled her close, his hands framing her face. "This is our beginning," he said. "Whatever comes next, we will face it together." "Together," Josephine agreed, and then she kissed him with all the love in her heart. That night, as she lay in her husband's arms in their own bed in their own home, Josephine thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had left Boston looking for adventure, for a life that mattered, for something that was hers. She had found all of that and more. She had found a purpose in teaching, a community in Palisade, and most importantly, she had found love with a man who saw her for who she truly was and cherished every part of her. "What are you thinking about?" Owen murmured against her hair. "How happy I am," Josephine said. "How lucky I am that you found me in that snow." "I am the lucky one," Owen said, his arms tightening around her. "I found the woman I was meant to spend my life with." They fell asleep holding each other, and Josephine dreamed of the future they would build together. The first year of marriage was both harder and more wonderful than Josephine had imagined. The reality of frontier life was harsh, with endless work from dawn to dusk. Owen spent his days building up their small herd and working on expanding the cabin, while Josephine continued teaching during the school year and spent her summers putting up food and tending a garden. They had very little money and had to be creative about making ends meet, but they were happy. In their second year of marriage, Josephine discovered she was expecting a baby. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. The nearest doctor was in Glenwood Springs, hours away, and childbirth on the frontier was dangerous. But Josephine had Margaret Thompson, who had delivered most of the babies in Palisade, and she had Owen, who promised he would not leave her side no matter what. Their son was born in February during another snowstorm, as if to remind them of how they had met. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Josephine was sure she would not survive. But Owen held her hand through all of it, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, whispering encouragement and love. When their son finally entered the world with a lusty cry, Owen wept openly. They named him James Owen Mercer, and he was perfect. Dark-haired like his father, with his mother's blue eyes and a will that suggested he would be a handful. Josephine had never known she could love someone so much, so instantly and completely. And watching Owen with their son, seeing the gentleness and devotion in every interaction, made her fall in love with her husband all over again. Life settled into a new rhythm. Josephine took a year off from teaching to care for James, returning when he was old enough to come to school with her. The children adored having a baby in the classroom, and James seemed to soak up knowledge from his earliest days. Owen continued to build up their ranch, trading work with neighbors and slowly acquiring more cattle and horses. Money was still tight, but they were making progress. When James was 3, Josephine became pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Samuel and Sarah. The delivery was easier than James's had been, perhaps because her body knew what to do this time, and Owen once again proved himself to be an exceptional partner and father. With 3 children, life became chaotic. The cabin, which they had expanded to 4 rooms, felt small and crowded. There was always laundry to do, meals to cook, children to mind. Josephine sometimes felt overwhelmed, torn between her love for her family and her desire to continue teaching. But Owen never complained about the chaos, and he took on far more than his share of childcare. He would walk the floor with a fussy baby so Josephine could grade papers, or take all 3 children out to the barn with him so she could have a few hours of quiet. "How did I get so lucky?" Josephine asked him one evening after they had finally gotten all 3 children to sleep. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, exhausted but content. "I ask myself the same thing every day," Owen said, pulling her close against his side. "I've got a beautiful wife, 3 healthy children, and a piece of land to call my own. What more could a man want?" "A full night's sleep," Josephine suggested, and they both laughed. As the years passed, their ranch prospered. Owen proved to have a gift for training horses, and word spread throughout Colorado about the quality of his stock. Buyers came from as far as Denver to purchase Owen Mercer's horses, and the money allowed them to improve the ranch and expand their herd. They built a proper barn, fenced in more pasture, and even added on to the house again, giving each of the children their own small bedroom. Josephine continued teaching, though as the school grew she took on an assistant. The town of Palisade was growing too, with more families moving in as the railroad and mining industries expanded. The rough edges were slowly being smoothed away, replaced by churches and schools and civic organizations. Josephine was instrumental in starting a lending library and organizing social events that brought the community together. But through all the growth and change, the heart of Josephine's life remained her family. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books as much as his mother and horses as much as his father. Samuel was his father's shadow, following Owen everywhere and mimicking his every move. Sarah was bright and spirited, with a stubborn streak that kept both parents on their toes. When Josephine was 35, she found herself pregnant once more, much to her surprise. She had thought her childbearing years were behind her, but it seemed God had other plans. This pregnancy was harder than the others, leaving her tired and ill for months. Owen hovered over her constantly, worried and protective, until she finally had to order him to go about his work, or she would lose her mind. Their 4th child was born on a warm May evening, and unlike the others, the birth was quick and easy. Another boy, with red gold hair that came from neither parent and green eyes that Owen said must have come from his grandmother. They named him Thomas, and he completed their family in a way Josephine had not even known was missing. Life with 4 children was even more chaotic than with 3, but Josephine and Owen had learned to work as a team. They supported each other through the hard times and celebrated the good times. They argued sometimes, as all couples do, but they never went to bed angry. They made time for each other, stealing quiet moments whenever they could, reminding themselves why they had fallen in love in the first place. One evening, when Thomas was about 2 years old, Josephine and Owen managed to sneak away for a walk after the children were in bed. Sarah, who was 11 by then, was old enough to watch the younger ones for an hour. They walked hand in hand through the meadow behind their house, where wildflowers bloomed in the gathering dusk. "You ever regret it?" Owen asked suddenly. "Leaving Boston, marrying me this life?" Josephine stopped walking and turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "Never," she said with absolute certainty. "Not for a single moment. This life with you, with our children, is more than I ever dreamed of. It is hard sometimes and messy, and nothing like what I imagined when I was a girl in Boston. But it is mine, it is ours, and I would not trade it for anything in the world." Owen pulled her close and kissed her with the same passion and tenderness he had shown on their wedding day 15 years earlier. "I love you, Josephine Mercer," he said against her lips. "More today than yesterday, and I will love you even more tomorrow." "And I love you," Josephine replied, her heart full to bursting, "forever and always." As the years continued to roll by, their children grew. James went to college in Denver, the first in their family to do so, studying law with plans to return to Colorado and help build up the justice system in the growing territory. Samuel took over more and more of the ranch work, showing the same natural gift for horses that his father had. Sarah developed a passion for teaching and became Josephine's assistant at the school, bringing fresh energy and new ideas. And Thomas, the unexpected gift of their later years, proved to be mechanically minded, fascinated by the new technologies that were slowly making their way west. When Josephine was 43, Colorado became a state. She and Owen rode into town with their children to celebrate, joining the entire population of Palisade in a party that lasted 2 days. As they watched the fireworks light up the night sky, Owen put his arm around Josephine's shoulders. "We have been part of building something here," he said quietly. "This state, this community, our family, that is a legacy to be proud of." Josephine leaned into him, feeling the same contentment and satisfaction she saw on his face. They had indeed built something remarkable. Not just the ranch or even the community, but a life filled with love and purpose and meaning. They had taken the chance that Storm had given them and turned it into something beautiful. More years passed. James married a young lawyer from Denver and brought her home to Palisade to practice law together. Samuel married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, combining their lands and herds. Sarah married a teacher from Glenwood Springs who came to help at the school and fell in love with both her and the town. Thomas, restless and adventurous, went east to study engineering but promised to return. And then there were grandchildren. James and his wife had a daughter they named Josephine. Samuel and his wife had twin boys, then a girl. Sarah and her husband had a boy and a girl in quick succession. The house that had once seemed too small for Owen and Josephine alone was now filled with the laughter and chaos of extended family gatherings. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party at the ranch. It seemed like the entire town showed up, along with people from neighboring communities who had known Owen and Josephine over the years. There was food and music and dancing, and people took turns telling stories about the couple everyone agreed was one of the great love stories of Palisade. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Owen took Josephine's hand and led her away from the house, up to a small hill that overlooked their land. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. They stood together in comfortable silence, looking out over everything they had built. "You remember that day in the snow?" Owen asked. "When I found you shaking and frozen and I wrapped you in my arms." "I remember every detail," Josephine said. "How could I forget?" "You saved my life that day." "You saved mine too," Owen said, turning to face her. "Not from the snow, but from a life half lived. Before you, I was just going through the motions, working and saving and planning for a someday that never seemed to come. But you made me want to live, really live. You gave me purpose and love and a family. You gave me everything." Tears rolled down Josephine's cheeks. "We gave each other everything," she corrected gently. "That is what love does. It multiplies, it grows, it creates something bigger than either person alone could be." Owen wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close the way he had in that cabin all those years ago, the way he had 1,000 times since. "I am never letting you go," he murmured into her hair. "Not now, not ever." "I know," Josephine said, holding him just as tightly. "And I am never letting you go either." They stood like that as the sun set and the stars began to appear, two people who had found each other in a snowstorm and built a life that was more beautiful than either had imagined possible. Behind them, the house glowed with lamplight, filled with the people they loved most. Ahead of them, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to their love story. The years that followed were gentler. Owen and Josephine gradually turned over more of the ranch operations to Samuel, though Owen still worked every day because he could not imagine doing anything else. Josephine retired from teaching at 60, passing the torch to Sarah and her husband. She spent her days writing letters to her scattered children and grandchildren, tending her garden, and working on a memoir she had decided to write about their life. They traveled some, taking a trip to Boston so Josephine could show Owen where she had grown up. Her parents were long gone, but she still had cousins there who were amazed that she had survived and thrived on the frontier. They visited James in Denver, marveling at how much the city had grown. They even took a train trip to California, standing on the shore of the Pacific Ocean and holding hands like newlyweds. But they were always happy to return to Palisade, to their ranch, to the life they had built. This was home in a way nowhere else could ever be. When Owen was 68, he had a heart attack while working in the barn. Samuel found him and brought him to the house, and the doctor from town came as quickly as he could. Josephine sat by Owen's bedside for 3 days while he fought, praying harder than she had ever prayed in her life. Their children gathered, faces drawn with worry, but Josephine refused to accept that this could be the end. On the 4th day, Owen opened his eyes. "Cannot get rid of me that easy," he whispered, his voice weak but his eyes full of life. Josephine laughed through her tears and kissed his forehead. "Do not ever scare me like that again," she ordered. Owen recovered, though the doctor warned him to take it easier. He grudgingly accepted that he could no longer work the way he once had, but he found other ways to be useful. He taught his grandsons about training horses, passing on a lifetime of knowledge. He sat on the porch and told stories to the great-grandchildren who were starting to arrive. He spent long evenings with Josephine, just talking and laughing and remembering. On a cool September evening when they were both in their early 70s, they sat on that same porch watching another sunset. They had been married for almost 50 years, and Josephine still felt that flutter in her heart when Owen smiled at her. She still reached for his hand without thinking. She still felt safe and cherished in his arms. "I have been thinking," Owen said, "about that cabin where we stayed during the storm. Wonder if it is still standing." "I have thought about that too," Josephine admitted. "That place where everything began, I would like to see it again." The next day, they borrowed Samuel's wagon and drove north, retracing the route Owen had taken all those years ago when he carried a half-frozen schoolteacher to safety. It took them most of the day to find the old trapper's cabin, but it was still there, weathered and worn but intact. They went inside, and Josephine was amazed by how small it seemed now. This space that had contained their entire world for 3 days was barely bigger than one room of their house. But standing there, she could feel the echoes of that time. She could almost see Owen stirring the fire, hear his voice telling stories to keep her mind off the cold. She could remember the feeling of being held through the night, of waking to find herself safe and warm in the arms of a stranger who would become her everything. Owen came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest just as he had done that first night. "I knew," he said softly. "Even then, I knew you were going to change my life." Josephine covered his arms with her own hands, leaning into his embrace. "And I knew I had found something precious," she said. "Even freezing and terrified, some part of me recognized that you were special, that we were special together." They stayed at the cabin for a while, reliving memories and marveling at the journey that had brought them from that desperate night to this moment of peace and fulfillment. Then they drove home, back to their ranch and their family, carrying the past with them but focused on the present and whatever future they had left together. More years passed, slower now but still full of joy. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary with a party even bigger than their 25th, with 4 generations of family and friends from all over Colorado. They danced together, moving slowly but still in perfect rhythm after all these years. They cut the cake surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and Owen gave a toast that left no dry eye in the house. 50 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his age, I found a woman shaking in the snow. I wrapped her in my arms and took her to safety, never imagining that I was really the one being saved. Josephine has been my partner, my love, my best friend for half a century. She has given me more happiness than any man has a right to expect. And if I could go back and do it all over again, I would not change a single thing, except maybe I would have proposed sooner. That got a laugh, and he raised his glass. To my beautiful wife, the love of my life, my Josephine, may we have many more years together. They did have more years, though not as many as they hoped. When Josephine was 76, she suffered a stroke that left her weak on one side. Owen never left her side during her recovery, learning how to care for her the way she had cared for him after his heart attack. Slowly, she regained some of her strength, enough to move around with a cane and still tend her garden on good days. On an evening in late December, almost exactly 55 years after Owen had found her in the snow, they sat together by the fire in their home. Outside, snow was falling gently, but inside it was warm and cozy. Their great-granddaughter Josephine, named for her, had come to visit and was playing on the floor nearby. Seems fitting, Owen said, watching the snow through the window. It was snowing when we met, and it is snowing now. Everything comes full circle, Josephine agreed. She was tired, more tired than usual, and she leaned her head on Owen's shoulder. I have had a good life, Owen. The best life. Thank you for giving me that. We gave it to each other, Owen said, but there was something in Josephine's voice that made his heart clench with worry. Are you feeling all right? I am feeling perfectly at peace, Josephine said. I have loved you with all my heart for 55 years, and I will love you for whatever time we have left, whether that is 55 more years or 55 more minutes. Do not talk like that, Owen said, his voice breaking. But he pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her the way he had done that first night and countless times since. Josephine closed her eyes, feeling safe and warm and completely loved. Hold me, she whispered. Just hold me, Owen. Always, he promised. I will never let you go. They sat like that as the fire burned low and the snow continued to fall outside. Little Josephine eventually fell asleep on the floor, and Sarah came to collect her, smiling at the sight of her grandparents still wrapped in each other's arms. She covered them with a blanket and left them in peace. When Samuel came by the next morning to check on them, he found them still sitting by the fire, still holding each other. Josephine had passed away peacefully in her sleep, and Owen, who had kept his promise to never let her go, followed her just a few hours later. The doctor said Owen's heart, which had been weak for years, had simply given out, but everyone who knew them understood the truth. Owen and Josephine had lived together, loved together, and when it was time, they had left together, neither willing to spend even a day without the other. They were buried side by side in the Palisade cemetery, on a hill overlooking the valley where they had built their life. The entire town came to the funeral, along with people from all over Colorado whose lives they had touched. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren stood together, united in their grief, but also in their gratitude for the example of love and commitment Owen and Josephine had shown them. On the shared headstone, beneath their names and dates, their children had inscribed a simple message that captured the essence of their love story. She was shaking in the snowy wind. The cowboy wrapped her in his arms and never let go. The ranch continued through the generations, passed down through Samuel's line. The school that Josephine had started still stood, now named the Abbott Mercer Elementary School in honor of both her and Owen's contributions to education in Palisade. The library she had founded grew into a proper building with thousands of books, and the story of how she and Owen had met, of their great love, became part of the town's history, told and retold to new generations as an example of how love can bloom even in the harshest conditions. Young couples would sometimes ride out to the old trapper's cabin, now preserved as a historical site, and imagine what it must have been like for those two people thrown together by circumstance to discover they were meant for each other. They would stand where Owen and Josephine had stood and promise each other that they would build a love like that, strong enough to weather any storm, because that was what Owen and Josephine had done. From that first moment when he wrapped his freezing arms around her shaking body and promised without words that she was safe, to the last moment when he held her as she drifted away, they had shown what true love looked like. Not perfect, not always easy, but constant and devoted and true. They had faced hardships and celebrated triumphs. They had raised children and built a community. They had grown old together, adapting to each other's changing needs while never losing sight of what had drawn them together in the first place. Their great-great-grandchildren would look at the old photographs displayed in the ranch house, at the memoir Josephine had written that was now published and available in the library. They would read her words describing that first night in the cabin, the way Owen's arms had felt like salvation, how she had known even then that he was someone special. They would read about their 55 years together, the joys and sorrows, the ordinary days and extraordinary moments. And they would understand that this was what love was meant to be. A choice made every day, a commitment honored through everything, a partnership that made both people better than they could be alone. The town of Palisade continued to grow and change, but the memory of Owen and Josephine Mercer remained constant, a touchstone and an inspiration. Their love story, born in a snowstorm and sealed with an embrace that lasted a lifetime, became legendary. People who visited the town would hear about them, about the cowboy who saved the schoolteacher, and then spent his life making sure she never regretted choosing him, about the educated woman from Boston who found more fulfillment on a small Colorado ranch than she ever could have in high society. And on snowy December nights, when the wind howled through the valley and the mountains were shrouded in white, people in Palisade would think of Owen and Josephine. They would remember how love could bloom in the unlikeliest circumstances, how a moment of crisis could become the foundation of a lifetime of happiness. They would hold their own loved ones a little closer and be grateful for the reminder that true love, the kind that lasts, is worth any hardship, any sacrifice, any struggle. Because in the end, that was the gift Owen and Josephine had given to everyone who knew their story. They had shown that love is not just a feeling but a choice, an action, a commitment kept through decades of living. They had proven that when you find the person you are meant to be with, you hold on and never let go, through snowstorms and sunny days, through youth and old age, through every moment until there are no more moments left. And even then, their love lived on in the lives they had touched, the family they had created, the community they had helped build. The story of the cowboy and the schoolteacher, of Owen Mercer and Josephine Abbott, who became Josephine Mercer, would be told for generations to come in Palisade, Colorado. It would be told to children learning about their town's history, to young couples starting their lives together, to anyone who needed to be reminded that love is the most powerful force in the world. And always, always it would end the same way. She was shaking in the snowy wind, the cowboy wrapped her in his arms, and he never, ever let go.